I work as a truck driver. It's not just my job, it's my way of life. Over the years, I've seen everything from accidents that people barely escaped with their lives to things I can't explain. But one night on I-90 in Montana changed my life forever. It was a dark, cold night. The moon was peeking out from behind thick clouds. I was driving from Seattle to Chicago and, to save time, I decided to drive non-stop. It was about 2 a.m. and the road was practically empty. The radio was picking up white noise, so I drove in complete silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine. Ahead, on the side of the road, I saw a figure. It was a man, his hand raised in a hitchhiking gesture. I usually never give strangers a ride, especially at night, but something about this man caught my attention. Maybe it was his pathetic appearance. The guy stood there in a light jacket, jeans, and sneakers despite the freezing weather. Or maybe I just felt guilty about driving by. I stopped the truck and opened it. "Where are you going?" I asked. The guy climbed in. He looked about 25 years old. He looked exhausted, with deep shadows under his eyes and a pale face. "To the next town," he answered quietly. We drove off. For the first few minutes, he was silent, looking out the window and clenching his hands as if they were icy. I decided to speak up to ease the tension. "It's a cold night," I began. "What are you doing here?" He turned his head and looked at me with a blank look, as if he wasn't quite there. "Just trying to get home," he answered, his voice shaking. I noticed that his clothes were oddly old-fashioned, like they were from the 80s. It confused me a little, but I didn't pay much attention to it. "Do you live far away?" "Not anymore," he said in a tone that sent shivers down my spine. The road ahead of us suddenly became foggy. The headlights of my truck, usually bright as spotlights, now barely pierced the thick fog. The guy didn't seem to notice. I tried to distract myself from the growing feeling of anxiety and looked at him. His face was even paler than before, and his hands. They were grayish, as if they hadn't been touched by blood. "Are you okay?" I asked, hoping that he would say something that would dispel my fears, but he didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed ahead. "Here. Stop here," he said. I looked where he was pointing. We were in the middle of an empty highway. No signs, no buildings, not even streetlights. "Here?" I asked, surprised. "Stop." His voice became louder, almost commanding. I didn't want to argue, so I slowly stopped the truck. The guy opened the door and got out without even thanking him. He walked to the side of the road and disappeared into the fog. I remained sitting in the cab, feeling a strange mixture of fear and relief. But before I could move, a scream came from the fog, a terrible, heartbreaking scream that made my soul sink into my heels. I jumped out of the truck with a flashlight, shone it on the side of the road, but there was no one there. No tracks on the ground, no signs that someone had just gotten out of my truck. When I returned to the cab, something on the passenger seat caught my attention. It was a piece of paper. On it, written in a trembling hand, was, "He's still here. Don't look back." I felt the air around me become heavy and cold. I didn't look back. I started the engine and sped away from that place. The next morning, I told this story to a local worker at a nearby gas station. He looked at me for a long time, and then said, you're not the first person to see him. This guy died on that highway back in 1982, when his car went off the road. Since then, people sometimes pick him up, and he always disappears in the same place where you dropped him off. This story still haunts me. Sometimes I feel like he's still somewhere nearby. After talking to the gas station worker, I couldn't work calmly anymore. This whole story, its details, its oddities, all of it was spinning in my head. I tried to forget about it, but no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't. And the strangest thing is that with each new trip, it seemed to me that then was not the last time we met. A few weeks later, I got a route on that very road again. When the dispatcher told me this, my insides sank. But I couldn't refuse, I needed the money, and this was one of the fastest ways. The road was as empty and gloomy as that night. Only now I paid attention to every little thing, peered into the shadows and headlights of oncoming cars. When I reached the very section where I dropped the guy off, my hands began to shake on their own. Just drive past. Don't stop. And then I saw him again. On the side of the road, in the same place, stood the same guy. This time he didn't raise his hand or ask me to stop. He just stood there, staring at me. My heart started beating so hard that I could barely breathe. I pressed the gas pedal, trying to get past him, but as I passed, I thought I saw him turn around, and his face twisted into a horrible grimace, as if he were screaming, but I couldn't hear the sound. When I looked in the rearview mirror, he was gone. A couple of miles later, I noticed that the air in the cabin had become icy. My breath was escaping in white vapor, and my fingers were starting to go numb. I turned the heater on full blast, but it didn't help, and then I heard his voice. Why did you leave me there? I shuddered so hard that I almost drove off the road. The voice was clear, as if it was right behind me. I turned around abruptly, but the cabin was empty. You wanted to help. But you didn't give me a ride. Why did you leave me? And then I saw him. He was sitting in the passenger seat, just as pale, with a dull look in his eyes. His lips barely moved, but I heard every word. You have to take me home. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, but I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Who are you? I managed to say, trying not to scream. You know who I am, he whispered. I stopped the truck on the side of the road, unable to continue. When I turned around, the passenger seat was empty. But on the glass, covered with a thin layer of condensation, a few words appeared, "Take me home." That was the beginning of the end of my career as a truck driver. After that, I tried to avoid night trips, but each time his ghost seemed to grow stronger. He began to appear not only on that road, but on my other trips as well. It all ended when I decided to follow through. I contacted a local archivist, who found an article about his accident. The guy's name was Edward Halley, and he really did die on that road. The article mentioned that his body was found a week after the accident, but not in the car itself, as if someone had dragged it out and left it. I returned to that stretch of road with one decision. "Edward, I'm here to take you home," I said, getting out of the car in the complete darkness. And then he showed up. This time he looked different, calmer, though still sickly pale. He got into the truck without saying a word. We drove for a long time. He pointed at every turn, without saying a word. Finally, We reached an old cemetery, immersed in fog. "Here," he said, and his voice was softer now. He got out, closed the door, and then turned to me. "Thank you," he said before disappearing into thin air. I haven't seen him since that day. But sometimes, when I drive past cemeteries or deserted roads at night, I think about how some souls are just looking for peace. And sometimes they find it. Before moving on to the second story, I want to ask you to subscribe and share your opinion in the comments. Thank you, my friend. I will try to make you like it. I am from Boston. When I was 23, I had a girlfriend who I dated for 2 years. But recently we broke up. It was a weird time in my life, when you are kind of wandering, trying to figure yourself out. Maybe searching for meaning without realizing it. My grandmother lived a long life with my grandfather. She is religious and went to church services, one might say fervently, after my grandfather died, and I began going to church with her every Sunday to support her because I felt like I needed it. My grandfather was a well-known and respected veteran in our city, and his death left a huge void in her life even though she was grieving. Her faith was unwavering. She told me she knew he was finally reunited with God. I saw how much it helped her. To be honest, I admired it, the kind of faith that brings real peace. I think people search for something like that their whole lives, even if they can't always express these words. One day after the service I saw a girl. It was not unusual because our community was very close-knit, especially in the church, and it seemed like everyone already knew each other. And she was stunning with dark curly hair and deep brown eyes. I was simply drawn to her, but I was embarrassed to approach her. We went home, but the image of that girl did not leave my head. I promised myself that next Sunday I would definitely approach her and talk to her. The week went by as if it had been a whole year. Finally, Sunday came, and after the service I approached her and we started talking. Her name was Kelly, and there was something mysterious and attractive about her. I could not tear myself away from her. I tried to ask her about the past, about her family and home, but she joked and said that I would have to ask her out on a date. I really enjoyed chatting with her. After a few happy banters, she told me that her family had recently moved to our area and she went to college nearby, so I hadn't seen her before. By the end of our conversation I managed to get her phone number and was on cloud 9. We often texted and exchanged photos on social media. I remember one time I was looking at her Instagram and was surprised that she had so few followers, but I even liked it. No one wants to fall in love with someone the whole world knows. We talked about a lot of things and eventually she told me about her family. I don't want to go into details, but they had a hard time. Her stepfather was a terrible alcoholic and often abused her by her mother. But her biological father was even worse. I didn't go into details, as I understood it they had to move to get away from him. She transferred to another school and left everything she knew. I didn't want to pry and ask her about it. I was just glad that she opened up to me. I liked that she was mysterious, but I hadn't gotten to know her better yet. The following Sunday she was there again. I took it as a sign, and after the service I asked her out on a date. She didn't hesitate, she just smiled and said yes, and we agreed to meet during the week. I thought about her all week and was nervous before our first date. When the evening finally came, we didn't make anything complicated, went to a movie and had dinner, nothing special, just a quiet evening. Then we could talk and get to know each other better. To be honest, I thought everything was going great. She was a great conversationalist and seemed genuinely interested. Which was nice. I didn't want the evening to end, so I suggested that we go for a little drive so that we could talk. We got on the highway and drove a little away from the city. It was windy and there were trees on both sides. Everything was perfect. It's crazy how everything can change in an instant. I'll never be able to get what I'm about to tell you out of my head. Suddenly she started talking, but not in English. Her words were fast and unintelligible. At first I thought she might be joking or checking. But then I noticed her eyes. They rolled back, only the whites were visible. I turned the wheel sharply, almost crashed into the fence. My heart almost jumped out. She looked like she was in some kind of trance. I pulled myself together and stopped. I'm trying to stay calm. At that moment I was in shock. I took out my phone and called an ambulance. I don't know what to say except that she seemed to have a seizure. While I waited I kept looking at her. I didn't know if she knew where she was. She was still talking and she seemed to be shaking all over. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to touch her, but I felt like I had to do something. Then suddenly she turned her head and looked at me and immediately went silent. Her eyes became normal. She looked at me with wild eyes. I will never forget that look in my life. Before I could say anything she threw the car door open and literally ran into the woods. I tried to understand what had just happened, but I couldn't move. My head was spinning and I was sure my hands were still shaking. I sat like that until the police and paramedics arrived. I told them everything. Even though it sounded crazy, I told them all the details, about what she looked like and how she ran away. The police nodded and wrote down the statement assuring that they would do everything possible to find her. I must have looked crazy, but they were understanding. After that night she disappeared and never saw her again. I looked for her in the church, but she never came. Her Instagram account was deleted and she apparently blocked my number. I even asked the church if they knew her, but no one did. I don't know what happened to her and I probably never will. I don't live there anymore and my memories of home are pretty vague because of that incident. What I'm about to tell you was the strangest thing that ever happened to me. My name is Mary, and a few months ago, my friend Carol and I were driving from Florida to New Jersey. We were driving back from visiting some friends who were studying there. It was fun, but Carol and I had to get home. We had planned this trip as a short road trip, just the two of us, with lots of snacks, music, and time to catch up. We hadn't seen each other in forever. Looking back, I probably would have been better off staying another night with our friends, but I wanted to get home. We were going to drive the whole way in one go. We drove all night and the next morning, a few hours after sunrise, my back started to hurt from sitting in one position for so long. And I told Carol that we needed to stop somewhere, stretch our legs, and maybe find something to eat before we hit the road again. We drove down a few more exits before finally pulling into a bustling tourist town. For the life of me I can't remember the name of the town. It was one of those places that usually attracts tourists, with signs pointing out attractions and promises of unique shops or local history. But as we drove into town I felt something was wrong. The streets were small and the buildings looked like they had seen better days 100 years ago. Too rickety for a place that was supposed to be for tourists. It's hard to explain, but there was a feeling that something was wrong. Although I didn't understand what exactly. I'm sure everyone has driven through a ghost town at least once, where all the shops are open but everything looks abandoned. That's the case here. Nothing was actually abandoned, it just looked that way. It didn't look like a typical haunted place, which was weird enough that I remembered it. the first stop was a convenience store. We had to drive quite a distance before we stopped to stretch our legs and get a bite to eat. We went into the store. Everything looked pretty normal inside, but I immediately realized that they didn't have the drink that Carol likes so much. She's a bit capricious, so I decided to suggest that she go somewhere else. I grabbed the first drink I saw from the first shelf for myself, as I was really thirsty, and went to the checkout to pay. The cashier was a woman of about 30 to 35 years old. As far as I can remember, she had dark brown hair and she was quite tall. Everything looked normal. I only remembered her because she was wearing suspenders, which I had never seen anywhere before. I paid for my drink and we left. Carol pointed to another store across the street and we decided to go in there. When we went into the second store, my stomach literally twisted. The cashier behind the counter was an exact copy of the girl who worked in the first store. All the same hair, the same face, the same height and the same suspenders, everything the same. I froze looking at her. I saw that she was uncomfortable with my gaze. Finally, I asked her if she had a twin sister. She looked at me strangely, almost with disbelief, and said that she did not have a twin sister and that she was an only child. The cashier narrowed her eyes and said that it was strange to ask such questions. That is probably true. I tried to explain everything, but she said nothing more. There was a strange feeling and I left the stores taking Carol with me. She was confused, but I explained to her what had happened and asked if she noticed anything. Carol said that she did not remember what the other cashier looked like and that I was probably just tired from the trip, but I knew exactly what I saw and told her that I would prove it. We ran back to the first store, but when we went in there, the cashier looked completely different from the one I remember. She was completely different, short, with blonde hair, looked middle-aged. There was no way she could be confused with the cashier. She didn't even look her age, as if I had imagined the whole thing. Carol told me to just forget about it and that I was tired, but I insisted that I hadn't imagined it. In the end, I had to give in that I couldn't wait to get out of there, but we needed gas. We pulled into the first gas station we came across. There was not a soul in the day. It was completely empty, just our car, the pumps and a small building where you could pay. We were literally the only ones in the entire parking lot. Carol spent a long time looking for her drink, but of course it was not there. I paid, waited for her and we left. We were there for only a few seconds. A few seconds ago the gas station was completely empty and now it was packed to capacity. There were a lot of people there. It was very strange. All the pumps were occupied and even a few cars were waiting in line, as if we were at rush hour at the busiest gas station in the state. All the parking spaces in the back were also occupied. What's worse, it seemed to me that everyone was looking at us as we walked to the car. I have never felt so uncomfortable under the gaze of people. This time Carol agreed that something strange was going on. I felt that we both had the same creepy suspicion, as if we had left reality for a second. And when we returned, something had changed. We decided to forget about food and just get back on the highway. I didn't have much of an appetite anyway. We barely talked on the way. I wasn't scared, but I had a bad feeling. I don't know how to explain it. When we drove further, while we were talking, a Toyota with a Sienna drove past us with a cracked windshield. I remember it well because there was a big web of cracks on the glass, and it was badly scratched on the side. It was hard not to notice. Carol joked about it, but I don't remember exactly what she said. We had just started to relax when everything went wrong again. About 10 minutes later, the same minivan drove past us again. We were both 100% sure of it. Again, it was impossible not to notice this huge crack on the windshield. How is this even possible? We were driving in a straight line at a fairly high speed. It certainly couldn't be an accident. But the probability that we met two identical Siennas with identical cracks on the windshield was negligible. Carol started repeating "Oh my God" over and over again, and I could see that she was on the verge of panic. She asked me to speed up, which I did to her, and I was on the verge of a breakdown, but I had to control myself as a driver and for Carol. More than anything in the world, I wanted to get back on the highway and forget about this place forever. I looked at the navigator and saw that an hour had passed since we left the gas station, which was almost impossible. I wanted to tell Carol about this, but I didn't know if she could stand anything weird anymore. My heart was in my boots, but I just kept driving. I even started to think that the navigator would drive in circles, but in the end we got on the highway, and that's where the nightmare ended. When we got home, no matter how many hours passed, it seemed like we were waking up from some strange, unrelated dream. I'm not kidding. When I think about it, it still seems like a dream to me. Usually people look at me strangely when I tell this story, but I still can't explain what happened there. I tried to search the internet for information about strange occurrences in such places, and I really found several similar stories. The strangest thing is that I had this feeling that I still can't describe. Because of this moment, I didn't know what it means when you have a bad feeling. It's like every cell in your body is begging you to notice that something is wrong. I never want to experience this feeling again.